Good afternoon. It is Thursday afternoon. The date is April 2nd. I hope you all are doing well. We're going to just talk a little bit about nutrition and chronic diseases, and I think for a lot of you this will be review. And then at the end, toward the end, I'm going to talk a little bit more about your food biotechnology assignment. And for the 210 section A, your due date is 4/8. And for my section 210B, your due date is going to be 4/10. So be sure and stay all the way to the end, because that is going to be your way of finding out about that assignment. So let's go on and talk a little bit about nutrition and chronic diseases. And I think this is a review for most of you, but reviews never hurt. So discussing some of those objectives that you need to make sure that you concentrate on when you study for your final is the relationship between risk factors and chronic diseases. And in particular, we're going to talk about cardiovascular disease and diabetes and cancer. So keep those in mind. Those are going to be the important ones. And you see the next three objectives on there are about those three diseases in a little bit more specifically about the relationships between that and diet. And then we'll talk about my favorite thing, a little bit about fruits and vegetables in your diet and how important those are. And then just a little touch on one of the emerging sciences, and I won't bore you with it because it's just really exciting to me, but it's called nutritional genomics. So as far as nutrition goes, there's two types of diseases. And a disease is a disorder that impairs or disrupts normal body function or organ function for that matter, and it often improves characteristics with signs and symptoms, or produces particularly some signs and symptoms. One class of disease is infectious disease, and those are caused by specific pathogens. Yeah. Okay, we all know about that, right? We're getting educated on infectious diseases every day, sometimes 2 and 3 hours at a time. And against these kind of diseases, the body's best defenses is its own natural immunity and preventative measures like we're taking, provided by public health services. And eventually, hopefully by next fall, vaccines, and then sanitation is important. So I'm not going to go on about that because I know that we have all really gotten that beaten into our heads here lately. So we will look at the next slide. Is going to show us a little bit more about the chronic diseases that we have. But keep in mind that the infectious diseases there's only 2 in the top 10 list of killers, and that is pneumonia and influenza, and we'll look at that in just a minute. So here are the leading causes of death in the United States, and you can see that the primary causes here, there's only 2 that are infectious, and the rest are the rest are different types of reasons. The red ones are diet related, so it's important to realize that that is very important too. A lot of deaths associated with this has multiple causes, but diet influences the development of heart disease, some types of cancer, and then strokes, which also is a part of the cardiovascular system, and then diabetes as well. You can see this takes a little bit. The next couple of slides are about the concept of risk factors associated with chronic disease. And they are correlated because they often occur together with diseases, but there's no single risk factor that can be blamed for a disease because all those factors work in teams. Some of those risk factors are modifiable, which means we have an impact on them depending on what our decision is about our lifestyle, and then some of them are not modifiable, and of course that's going to be like your genetic traits, that type of thing. So just keep in mind that they're all kind of together in a lump. We know that infectious diseases have a single cause, that exposure to a pathogen, but when we're talking about chronic disease, that is a whole different animal. And these are some of the common risk factors, and a lot of these you see, these on this page in particular, are the ones that we could have an impact on. Excessive alcohol intake, and we'll look a little bit more in a minute about what that is defined as. And then we've talked about physical activity, when we were talking about performance nutrition and other information about how we can be a little bit more active in our lifestyle. Smoking and tobacco risk are also, or that use of those is a high risk for certain chronic diseases. And then our diet, and you can look at all the things that could potentially impact that. The saturated fat in your diet, having a low fiber diet, a diet that's low in vitamins and minerals, and you know, if I'm the one you've been listening to all semester, that means a low intake of fruits and vegetables. And then a diet that's high in sodium and maybe even low in potassium, which we'll talk about. And then a diet that's too high or too low in calories, whether that results in obesity or malnutrition. So the risk factors on this page, and I hope you can see that are highlighted in blue, that defines what we call the metabolic syndrome. And if you have 3, then you're at a greater risk for particularly a cardiovascular disease. And we'll look at those in a little bit more detail later. But you see that diabetes has insulin resistance. Obesity is something that puts people at greater risk, particularly central obesity. People with hypertension, and we'll define that. And then folks that have arteriosclerosis. In the U.S. today, more than 92 million people suffer from some sort of disease of the heart and the blood vessels, and that is known as CVD, or cardiovascular disease. That nomenclature kind of implies that it includes diseases of the blood vessels as well as diseases of the heart. So it represents a number of diseases all rolled into one. Arteriosclerosis is a common form, and we used to call that hardening of the arteries because the major form of it does have a plaque formation and does make the arteries less elastic. And your arteries do have muscles in them and nerves as well. So this kind of disease really can impact their ability to expand and contract given the flow of blood through your cardiovascular system. One thing that's listed here in particular is chronic hypertension, and it's one of the most prevalent forms of cardiovascular disease. It afflicts about 85 million U.S. adults, and it's been rising steadily. But one of the problems with that is it has no recognizable symptoms for most people. But it is a primary cause of stroke and one of the big causes of death in the United States. Arteriosclerosis begins with damage to the cell linings of the arteries, and it's caused by a lot of different things. High blood, low density lipoprotein cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol, that's kind of bad for us. Things like hypertension and diabetes and toxins from cigarette smoking, obesity, and then certain viral and bacterial infections can also impact that. So here you see just a schematic of kind of what happens. So first you've got the development of fatty streaks, particularly at certain points. Usually at the branch, like you see in the picture, is where it occurs in your arteries. And then you get enlargement and hardening of those fat deposits, and that's when it becomes what we call a plaque. And the lumen of the artery narrows, and that produces a lot of inflammation, which you can imagine. Those particles of low-density lipoprotein cholesterol get trapped in the blood vessel walls, and then they get a lot of free radicals that also get trapped, and they're produced from that inflammation that occurs. And then your body senses that something's going on, and so it sends white blood cells to that scene to get rid of those free radicals or the oxidized low-density lipoproteins, and they get a foamy appearance as a result of that. Some plaques get covered with coatings that are really hardened by calcium. That's why it's important to keep calcium levels normal in your blood. And a lot of times the inner part of those artery walls get covered with rigid plaques. And once they form, a spasm of that arterial wall or an increase in blood pressure can tear the surface off of it and causes it to kind of rupture. And this is just a explanation of how that occurs. And keep in mind that arteries, this is where blood pressure can make such a difference, because arteries can expand with each heartbeat and accommodate that blood that flows through them, but arteries that are hard or blocked cannot expand, and that's when blood pressure really has a big impact on that. And here you just see some information about folks that are at risk for cardiovascular disease. So let's look at some of these. Individuals have a normal blood pressure at the age of 59 or 55 still have a risk, 90% risk of developing high blood pressure during their years after age 55. And like I said, hypertension comes without symptoms, so unless you're being checked regularly, then you really don't know that you have hypertension. But if the blood pressure is even slightly above normal, it increases your risk of heart attack and stroke. So usually folks that reach middle or old age exhibit at least one of the factors that are listed here, and just age itself is a risk factor. And a lot of people have several factors that increase their risk. So when we're talking about gender, more than 44 million U.S. women have cardiovascular disease, and the number's increasing. And used to, men held that dubious honor of having the highest risk of cardiovascular disease, but women are really closing that gap, even though we're really trying to make people aware and give them ideas for prevention and treatment. In all of its different forms, cardiovascular disease kills more women in the U.S. Than any other cause. And we've seen that even people with high genetic risk for cardiovascular disease can improve their odds of staying healthy by doing things like engaging in regular activity and not smoking and controlling their weight and eating healthier. Another thing that impacts it is a high blood glucose level. So any loss of control of blood glucose, even a transitory one, causes the conditions of the arteries to deteriorate. And if it progresses to full-blown diabetes, it's a major risk factor for all kinds of cardiovascular disease. Atherosclerosis, or the clotting or development of plaques, progresses a lot more rapidly in people with diabetes and has a tendency to block those blood vessels and obstruct circulation. And that's one of the common side effects from diabetes is poor circulation. The other risk factor is obesity, and especially abdominal obesity, physical activity as well. Inactivity significantly increases that risk for cardiovascular disease, and it contributes to things like a high LDL or bad cholesterol, a low high density protein or high density lipoprotein cholesterol, or that good cholesterol, high triglycerides, and hypertension and diabetes all do affect and increase risk factors for cardiovascular disease. But on the other hand, weight loss and physical activity protect against that. Even just a small amount of weight loss can have a big impact by lowering that bad cholesterol, raising that high or happy or good cholesterol, and lowering triglycerides and blood pressure. And just a word about smoking and tobacco use. Cigarette smoking really increases your risk for cardiovascular disease. Body tissues that are starved for oxygen by smoke demand a lot more heartbeats to get the oxygenated blood where it needs to be. So that increases the heart's workload. And if you do that over a long period of time, of course, that's going to truly impact your cardiovascular system and the health of your cardiovascular system. And smoking does deprive the heart muscle itself of the oxygen that it needs to maintain a steady beat. It damages blood platelets, so it makes clotting more likely to occur, or that thrombosis that we talked about earlier. And I don't think alcohol is listed on here with cigarette smoking, but alcohol consumed regularly above and beyond 2 drinks a day for men and 1 for women is strongly associated with hypertension and may interfere with even the drug therapy that many people are on, which is designed to lower their blood pressure. Now that we know that a special diet that is high in fat, saturated fat, and trans fat, and low in vegetables, fruits, and whole grains has a big impact as well. So LDL, remember the bad cholesterol, carries cholesterols to the cells, including the cells that line the arteries, and that's why it builds up there as part of plaques like we described earlier. So the higher the low quality or low density lipoprotein or bad cholesterol concentration is, the more rapid the progression of atherosclerosis, and the lower that the bad cholesterol is in the blood, the slower the progression. So it's significantly associated with the level of bad cholesterol in your blood. On the other hand, high cholesterol levels or high density lipoprotein cholesterol carries the cholesterol away from the body cells to the liver to be metabolized for other uses or even just disposed of. So those high density lipoproteins or that good cholesterol is better for you. So if it gets higher in your blood, then that's a positive thing because it carries proteins that help eliminate or inhibit that inflammation that has to occur when plaques form in your blood vessels. A high blood triglyceride concentrations also have an effect on the promotion or the development of those plaques as well. So you need to try your best to get your triglyceride level low if it is high. A diet that is high in saturated fats, and we talked about that is like animal fats and butter and that type of thing, and also high in trans fats, which are those fats that you find in snacks, those hydrogenated fats. That also is going to increase that bad cholesterol in your blood. So you need to really try to make a difference in your diet as far as that goes. And then a high salt intake also predicts cardiovascular disease. and we think it is associated with most people's hypertension, and that it's also associated with stroke mortality. And we kind of talked about metabolic syndrome before, but keep in mind that it is a cluster of 5 risk factors, and those risk factors are listed here. The high fasting blood glucose level, or insulin resistance is another way that we term that. Central obesity, and you can see the pictures here, a big belly, just to be pretty blunt. Hypertension, low blood, high density lipoprotein, or the good cholesterol, and then high blood triglycerides. So to have metabolic syndrome, you only have to have 3 of those 5 risk factors, and then you can be, or you are diagnosed as that. So just keep in mind that metabolic syndrome involves inflammation, and it can elevate the risk of blood clotting. So try to remember that that is an important thing that we need to try to keep in mind. So what can you do? You can look at yourself and look at your family and determine whether or not you are at risk for cardiovascular disease. So first, study yourself and study your genetics. And there's actually a way that you can go on the American Heart Association website, and there is a test that you can take that will actually determine your cardiovascular risk. So, you might want to do it now because you're young and you don't think you need to, but keep in mind that that's something that you might want to look at later on, or maybe if you've got a family member that you're worried about, you might want to have them and refer them to that site, because I hope you can influence the people around you as you learn a little bit more about the diseases that are influenced by diet. So as far as certain things, like you assess your or somebody else's health condition and your medical history, and then own it and face the lifestyle habits that that person is doing, or things that are harming their health. And if they already have things like diabetes or hypertension, then start to make changes and take action. People that are overweight and have hypertension can lower their blood pressure by losing as little as 5 to 10% of their body weight. Smokers, if they're a smoker, they should quit. And non-smokers are advised to stay away from exposure to secondhand smoke, if at all possible. Alcohol use, that's considered okay up to a point, but no more than 1 drink per day for a woman and no more than 2 for a man. And the more family members you have affected, the earlier the age of onset and the greater the risk. So if you've got somebody who had like a mild heart attack at the age of 45 or 50, that is a significant risk for any other family member. Try to know your blood pressure, okay? So keep that in mind, and you all are young, and I realize that that's not something you're really worried about, but keep in mind you don't have symptoms for an elevated blood pressure, and it really does make a difference about what is important. So up to 129/80 or less than 80, if it goes above that, or if it goes above, usually they're saying about 140/90, then that indicates there's a problem and you need to start taking some steps to reduce that blood pressure. So as far as a diet goes, look at your sodium intake and salt intake, particularly if you're still working on your dietary analysis project. Keep in mind that, and I hope you saw when you did some of your assessments, that we really are a society that eats way too much salt. So lowering that salt intake is a key to management of your blood pressure. Most people recommend, or most associations and studies have shown that an upper level of 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day is all that we really need, or all that we should get, let's say. All that we really need is about 1,500 milligrams of sodium per day. And this talks about increasing your potassium intake. So keep in mind that potassium can help to regulate blood pressure. And if people have a low potassium intake, especially when it's combined with a high sodium intake, that has a tendency to impact their blood pressure and make it go up and increase their risk of death from stroke. So in addition to the things listed at the top, as far as a diet to reduce cardiovascular risk, and we talked about those earlier, keep in mind your sodium intake and your potassium intake are also important things to evaluate. Let's move on and talk about diabetes, another one of those chronic diseases that is associated with diet. Over 1/3 of the U.S. adults, or 86 million more, have come to develop pre-diabetes, and that is just some symptoms that exhibit warning signs of diabetes to come. There are two forms of diabetes, which we've kind of discussed in the past, but just to review, there's a type 1 and type 2. Type 1 diabetes is something that usually sets in during childhood or adolescence, but it can begin at any age, even late in life, we're finding. Although type 1 is far less common than type 2, it is increasing in prevalence as well by about 3% each year. Especially, you'll find that happening with children. And you have to keep in mind that type 1 is an autoimmune disorder, and it is one that we think something has caused antibodies to attack the pancreas, which is where insulin is released. And so that's why they're terming it an autoimmune disorder. And remember, insulin's a protein, and you can't take it orally in this case because the digestive tract digests it. So with a type 1 diabetic, they always have to have insulin injections to control their blood sugar. And this is just kind of a depiction of a type 1 and a type 2, and you see in the blood vessel, and then the pink portion is trying to depict a cell. So you see in the blood vessel on the left-hand side, that would be type 1 because there's no insulin there at all. On type 2, insulin is in the bloodstream. It's just not as effective about taking the glucose into the cell for some reason. And there's a lot of controversy about why that is, but that is something that does occur. So the primary defect in type 2 is an inadequate response of the body cells to that hormone insulin, that protein. And that's why we call it insulin resistance. So that is what you see with that patient population. And that's why there's some different ways to treat it, because it does present differently. So when the muscle and the fat and the other cells become insulin resistant and they fail to take up the glucose from the blood glucose concentration begins to rise. And when the blood glucose is high, the cells are starved for energy. And then you get kind of a triple amount of symptoms that reappear or that appear as a result of that. So you get somebody who they're hungry all the time. So they have really intense hunger. Even though there's plenty of glucose in their blood, the cells can't reach it, or the cells can't absorb it properly, so they're starved for energy. And then you see frequent urination in that population, that type 2 population too, because the kidneys are filtering out the excess sugar as much as they can. out of the blood, and they're having to draw water into the system from the body to excrete it and get rid of it. And then because of that, frequent urination, you get some dehydration that begins to set in, and then you get intensive thirst as a result of that. So looking at those systems or those symptoms and recognizing those symptoms is really important in treatment. And sometimes that is the first symptom identification that people have. It's important that you realize that there's some things that you can do about diabetes prevention. So know your histories, your family's history, and get tested. If you're overweight, people should lose weight. You should get physically active because that has a positive effect. And make sure that you control your carbohydrate intake. And we did kind of look at that when we talked about carbohydrates in that chapter. And then we know about the dietary fat, that we need to keep that at less than 10% of their calories if it is a saturated fat or an animal fat. Protein, really, unless you have renal failure, has no effect. So, it's just what normally people would use or need, which is about 0.8 grams per kilo. And then alcohol intake should be moderate. So let's look a little bit about cancer and cancer prevention. So the second leading cause of disability and death in the U.S. is cancer. And we know that cancer arises in the genetic material inside of a person's cells. And that's called carcinogenesis. And that usually proceeds very slowly. And it may even continue for decades. But it can start when a cell's genetic material gets damaged from a carcinogen, and that could be something like radiation or free radicals, which we've talked about on and off throughout the semester, or just another cancer-causing chemical that occurs. So, life-threatening cancer begins with an event, and they usually call that an initiation. But following this, some environmental factors or hormones, different things can stimulate tumor growth. And when the tumor overwhelms the healthy tissue and it goes through the bloodstream to other parts of the body and starts tumors in other parts of the body, that is called metastasis. And that's when life-threatening cancer really begins. With our diet, carcinogens do occur in red and processed meats. So processed meats are like hams and deli meats and bacon and that type of thing. So you try to avoid those as much as possible. So processed meats are listed among human carcinogens by the World Health Organization, and that's because they contain so many additives and nitrites, and those are what give them a pink color and kind of keep them from having a lot of bacterial growth. But in the digestive tract, the nitrites and the nitrates form other compounds, and we know that those compounds have been found to be carcinogenic. And we've talked in my class about cooking methods. So when you cook meats at high temperatures like frying or broiling, it causes the amino acids or the protein in them to combine and form carcinogens. So when you grill things over an open flame, it causes the fat and the oil to splash on the fire and vaporize, and that's what creates those carcinogens. So the more you kind of burn or get that crust on the outside of meats and vegetables when you're grilling them, the higher the exposure incidence of carcinogens that are being formed. And smoking foods has the same effect. So iron is listed here from the diet. iron that you get from your diet and body stores is under study because we think there is some kind of link with iron and colon cancer, but we really don't know about it or what it is specifically, but we think that it has something to do with that high meat diet. You see French fries on this picture. So French fries, potato chips, those things contain another substance, which is called acrylamide, and that's produced when they're fried or baked at high temperatures. And sometimes that is metabolized in our body and damages the genes, which produces a mutation. And it is considered a probable carcinogen for humans. And just a little quick thing about environmental carcinogens. They present factors in the environment, also present risk of cancer. And that could be things just as simple as overexposure to the sun or exposure to radiation. So there's a lot of other things that can produce that as well, but just be aware of those environmental carcinogens. It goes all the way to the top, and what you get less often is the meats, like once a month, red meats and sweets, and then you've got moderate amounts of poultry and fish, twice a week, seafood, and every day, vegetables, fruits, whole grains, nuts, legumes, and exercise. So just a word about nutritional nutrigenomics. Just a couple of words, actually. So this is kind of my thing. I just love this because this branch of nutrition shows how genes affect nutrient metabolism. And it, I think, is going to be something that is significant. So nutrigenomics looks into gene mutations and programming and how that impacts, how food and nutrients impact that. Nutrigenetics is when you first look at the genes and then how that affects nutrient absorption. But it is a way that we can actually evaluate what's going on in our body. And there's some positives to it and, of course, negatives, just like you see with anything. Healthcare is kind of on the brink of genetic type of revolution. I know a lot of you probably had your genetics done through like Ancestry or 23andMe. And the medicine's changing according to those views on health and disease and nutrition. We are looking at how somebody can look into their genetic testing and determine whether or not they have a genetic risk for some medical conditions. Alzheimer's is one that you can do, celiac disease. So they're beginning to look more and more into disease-associated genetics. The science of nutritional genomics is giving us a lot of insights into some questions about nutrition and how that is affected, or how our genes affect nutrition and other related diseases that are related to nutrition like we've looked at today. So you can get all these genetic tests, but there's always a lot of arguments about whether it really makes us more cognizant or it translates into better health. And I just want to give you an example about broccoli. There's a phytochemical in broccoli and Brussels sprouts and other from the cabbage family, and we think it can really affect cancer processes because of the way that certain proteins change in cancer cells. And one characteristic of cancerous tissue is uncontrolled division of cells, and that's what causes or what results in tumors. And in test tubes, this protein that you find in broccoli reverses those cancer-promoting changes and gets control of that cell division a little bit better. And there's a lot of different phytochemicals involved in foods, like tea has different kind of flavonoids. Onions have sulfur compounds that have an impact. And then nutrients that we've studied already: folate, B12, C, vitamin C and D, selenium, zinc. All of those are food constituents that we think can act in some way to prevent cancer. Now, I'm not saying go out and take mega doses of this stuff, because you know some of them are dangerous and you can't do that. But just watch for the new research to come out about the impact of some of these things on cancer, because I think that's something that is definitely down the road. Now then, we are, I talked to you earlier about we are going to be doing, or you are going to be doing, sorry, it's you, not me, or Dr. Hammond, but you're going to be doing a report for us about biotechnology and the effect of that and genetic engineering on different types of foods. So I wanted to go ahead and go over this briefly so that you could kind of get an idea of what kind of things we're looking at and looking for. So most people in this country do consume foods that are products of genetic engineering, whether you realize it or not. Some food additives such as soy lecithin and high fructose corn syrup are made from these genetically engineered plants, and they enter the human food supply in different kinds of processed foods that we're exposed to on a daily basis. And we've had a lot of advances in this food biotechnology, good things. So they've really helped us solve some of today's most pressing food and energy problems, and they boost profits for farmers and some of the producers. And it may seem like this kind of technology is futuristic, but it has been available to us for a lot of years, because this kind of occurs naturally, some of this change or this technology. So it does occur naturally. So let's talk about selective breeding. So farmers influence the genetic makeup of food plants all the time, and animals as well, by looking at only the best farm animals and plants to use in planting or breeding. Okay, so today we've got healthy agricultural crops and animals, and it ranges like from cabbage and squash with certain kinds of notable properties, and all the way to pigs and cattle. And that's the result of years of selective breeding. And you see here that accelerated selective breeding gives an example of colorful carrots, like the purple and light yellow deep red varieties that you can see in the grocery store. And doesn't really change the nutritional value of those, but it does make a difference in like visual value of some of those. Some of the consumers, like of sweet corn, for example, may not recognize that the original native corn had sparse kernels like you see on the left-hand side of this picture. So through selective breeding, we have made the kind of corn that we're used to seeing, not the kind that only has a few kernels in it. So that is selective breeding. And to develop crops like this with the desired traits that we want, they take DNA information from those successful plants and they analyze it by the computer. And then the seedlings with the right genes are grown to maturity and produced to yield new breeds in a shorter period of time. And just to give you another example, 90% of the U.S. soybeans and 88% of animal-fed corn, not sweet corn like we do, but animal-fed, the kind that they grow corn for feeding animals. Those are genetically modified organisms, and we call those GMOs. And you see some of these have been treated, the ones that, like cotton, certain types of cotton and certain types of corn have been treated to be herbicide tolerant, and then others have been treated to be insect resistant. And when you treat them like that, they can significantly increase the cotton and the soybeans and the corn that are available to feed the world. So this is an important thing that can happen, and has positively happened, a positive thing that's happened in our past as far as farming goes. So with advances in this gene editing, scientists now alter molecules within a single DNA strand to get better results or more desired results. And they can start with DNA of a stem cell in order to do that and confer certain traits like disease resistance on certain crops. To make a disease-resistant potato, for example, the process starts when the DNA of a cell, or an immature cell, and we call those stem cells, from the eye of a potato are taken, and then they insert a gene into that stem cell that attacks potato plants. So that newly created stem cell is then stimulated to replicate itself and creates clone cells. And with time, that grows into a whole nother organism, in this case like a potato plant that makes a piece of a protein in each of these cells. And the protein enables the potato plant to develop resistance against an attack from a virus or a pest or something like that in a potato field. So it's a stepwise process that eventually impacts our human nutrition and what we are able to take. So it is a positive thing that happens over time. And this gives you an example of what has happened as far as this technology goes. And sometimes it's positive and sometimes it's negative. So there's always two different ways to look at things. So this rice that you see on the left-hand corner is called golden rice. The yellow one is. And then it gives us up to 35 micrograms of beta-carotene per gram of rice. And white rice has nothing. So because of this development as a result of genetically modifying the organism of rice, this yellow rice offers 80% more iron and zinc than ordinary rice. And it can relieve that iron deficiency anemia and zinc deficiency around the world. And I know that you remember from vitamin A that one of the big issues with vitamin A deficiency is blindness. So this yellow rice, just this substitute of yellow rice, can actually prevent blindness in so many undeveloped or underdeveloped countries. This other example here is with different types of effects on salmon. So the salmon that is affected with the genetically modified feeding that occurs reaches market size much faster and is able to fuel or give nutrition to certain populations as well. So here you see a little bit about selective breeding and that RNA technology and how that occurs. So keep in mind that that is just when you take the DNA strand of genes. It kind of looks like a strand of pearls in this pictorial here. And you can alter those by inserting certain genes into those and making those a little bit different. So there is a lot of promises from this, The genes of microorganisms can be altered to make certain pharmaceutical products or industrial products. And then you get greater crop yields from some of them, like some of the genetically engineered crops are either herbicide resistant and insect resistant, and they can both improve the yields in that specific crop or protect that farm land. So herbicide resistant crops, for example, promote weed control. So that they don't have to have as much soil tillage and weeding or spraying with herbicides. And when the roots die, the weeds, their roots hold that soil in place, and the crops begin to grow normally without competition for nutrients. So as for insect-resistant crops, GMOs made plant pesticides, and those are pesticides that are made by the plant tissues themselves. So where people can't afford to lose any food in certain areas of the world, where plant diseases and insects can claim up to 80% of the yield, these genetically engineered plants can save crops and give a lot of relief to millions of people that are hungry. The FDA also recently approved a genetic altered farm-raised salmon that gets its genes from two other fish, and that made it just as safe to eat as other fish, but did protect the environment and the natural systems a little bit better. So that was a positive thing because it gave them more opportunities for raising that new type of salmon. Okay, the rest of this is kind of a point counterpoint, and I'm not going to go through this because I think we're about through for today. So I left them on the end so that this was something that you could utilize to study for your project that is coming up on looking at biotechnology. So I do want you to pay attention to that project. There is some recommendations that I have posted to your the site on E360. Those recommendations are listed on there. So keep in mind that your requirements are primarily to write, after you look at certain references, then what I want you to do is do a word process of about 200 to 300 words, and just talk about genetically modified foods and what you know about their nutritional needs of the world's populations. And then there are questions on there for you to look at and address when you write your paper. If you use references, then be sure and cite those references. And there is actually a little quiz on there as well. So if you can find the answers to those questions on that quiz, there is an opportunity for extra credit for you for my 210B class. So make sure to go to E360, please, and look at the directions. It is listed under the file Food Technology Assignment. It gives you directions on what you need to write. It gives you that little quiz to give you a opportunity for earning 15 extra credit points, which is a big deal. And it also gives you a rubric that identifies how I'm going to grade it. So please look at those directions on E360, and I think that it is self-explanatory. Do not get verbose with me. Try really hard to keep it around 200 to 300 words, and remember, it is your opinion. There is no right or wrong answer. I just want an argument from you about this is my opinion, and this is why I think this way. And then answer those questions, and I will give you 25 points for the assignment and 15 extra points for the little quiz that is there if you can answer those questions as well. All right, have a good rest of your day, and I look forward to talking to you next week. Have a good weekend, stay inside, and stay well.